Hi, everybody. This is Joshua Daniel, and this is a commentary to the play before Easter. I mean for this commentary to be an audio version running over the visual, so you can watch as I talk through various elements of the play and try to give some keys to it. Here we've got Katie McGurvey, the children's minister, director of children's ministry for St. Columba's. We called her the shepherd of the play. She was helping direct. The play was a combination of people who had been given parts beforehand and people who were pulled out of the play without any warning. They didn't know they were going to have a part in the play until they got there. The idea there, of course, well, just to step back for a second, as Katie's introducing some various aspects of the play that we'll get to in just a second. Part of what motivated this idea behind the play is to think about how many Christians would have first heard the gospel, which is kind of through an oral narration before the canon had been officially collected, before there was a lot of handwritten copies of it, before the printing press. So much of the early Christian texts people would have had access to only through listening in a small church setting or in a house church. And so that was one of the original ideas. And of course, it evolved quite a ways from there. But so part of the idea was to have a group of people who were invited to be a part of it, who had just shown up to hear the gospel. And okay, so the play itself was meant to be a word-for-word retelling of the Gospel of Mark, everything before Easter. The play happened on the day before Palm Sunday, 2024. I called it the the vigil of Palm Sunday, which is, of course, not a thing. But and the idea was that if you came to church that week on Holy Week, starting the day before on Palm Sunday, in that 7-day period from before Easter, our play on the vigil of Palm Sunday, through the 7 days to the Great Vigil, in that period of time, you would hear almost the entirety of the Gospel of Mark and see quite a bit of it acted out in front of you. So this play before Easter is everything in the Gospel of Mark before Jesus descends the Mount of Olives, as we would reenact the very next day on Palm Sunday. So Mark chapters 1 through 10 is what this play is. And trying to take those sections, those chapters 1 through 10, with a bit of literary integrity and presenting it as a preamble to the Passion narrative that begins with Jesus descending the Mount of Olives. We divided those sections, chapters 1 through 10, into 5 sections. There's a handbill that you can find linked in below in the comments on page, let's see here, the 3rd page. 5 different sections. The first one is the beginning. So we begin in complete darkness. That mirrors the first words of the gospel, which is the beginning of the good news. The beginning there is a word that Mark likely meant to evoke images and thoughts of Genesis 1 in the beginning. Here we see a crucifer. That's my son Jude. He had begun at the very back of the nave on a slow funeral procession, carrying a crucifix. Even in the first half of Mark, chapters 1 through 10, the crucifixion of Jesus is something that looms but also defines kind of every aspect of it, either implicitly or explicitly, as we'll get to later on in the play. This is Mitchell Felton, who is our director of youth ministries, a priest at St. Columba's, who took on a huge amount of memorization for the parts of Jesus and stuck with Jesus throughout the whole play, except for the parts at the very end in Power Reconsidered, where Jesus gives several long monologues, which I took over as the narrator. Another one of the ideas for this is to think about the play happening in a church. And so even though the play is a word-for-word retelling, so I wrote the screenplay adding no dialogue whatsoever to the gospel itself. None of the words spoken, except for when there's mistakes or somebody forgot a cue or something like that. There's a little bit of inserted dialogue there that was unintentional and kind of happened on the fly, but mostly everything that said came directly from the gospel. So the words are all straight from the gospel, but the images, the icons, the iconography that we had was something that we came up with. And I wanted it to reflect something of a church service, a church processional, or what would proceed as would happen in a service. And so the cross coming in the beginning, also the lighting of the altar candles, setting both the altar right there in the chancel, but also the high altar in the very back where Jude is continuing to light the candles slowly. Here we have the introduction of the disciples, who will remain mostly in the boat, as most of chapters 1 through 10 of Mark, the disciples are often in boat journeys or being taught by the sea with Jesus. The sea plays a huge role in the first part of Mark, and so having the boat as the representative place for the disciples felt apt and appropriate. Okay, so here we've come to the first healing, Simon's mother-in-law. This woman, one of our youth at St. Columba's, was brought into the play right at the very end. And part of the idea of the play, too, is that you know exactly what's going to happen. We've all read the Gospel of Mark, and so there's not a whole lot of mystery. But so to introduce a few elements of surprise to what's happening. And here, Claire is sat the first seat and given a letter, the letter in, inviting those who are participating, those who are at the play, to wonder what's going on there. Another thing to draw your attention to is that we set the church up. Recording it was something that we decided to do last minute, and so we didn't have anyone. Jamal Williams, who runs all of our audio and visual at the church, did an amazing job with the lights and the audio and helped in so many ways, but I didn't anticipate having someone who could manipulate the video cameras as we are going. You did just a few minutes ago see a camera angle of the balcony up to the top of the right of the church. The church is broadly divided into 5 regions. The balcony to the top right, which you'll see the narrator and Jesus speak to, we labeled as the strong man section. So anytime Jesus has criticism, it's to throughout this part of the gospel, it's to a very select few people: the Pharisees, the scribes, the Herodians, and to various people sometimes who have demon possession. And so the conflict there is always into the same section. So sometimes as you're reading the gospel, it's hard to tell which way Jesus is aiming the criticism. Is it to the disciples? Is it to the crowd? My interpretation of it is that Jesus' criticism is almost always launched against the strongmen. Okay, here we come with, let's see here. We're calling the rest of the disciples now, who are, oh no, I'm sorry. This is, we're in chapter 2 now, and this is the friends who bring in the paraplegic man through the roof of the church. All these people jumped up when Katie, our shepherd, asked for some volunteers, not knowing exactly what they'd be asked to do. So super appreciative of the generous amount of help.
Child, your sins are forgiven.
Now, some of the scribes were sitting there, questioning in their hearts.
Opposite of the strong man, so we had the strong man up in the balcony, as the narrator is examining, I believe it's the scribes who object to this healing. Yes, blasphemy, they call it, in their hearts. Across from them, on the other side of the church, and the other side of the transept, is the law and the prophets, the good guys, the people that Jesus relies on to understand what the power and the presence of God is in this community at the time. Jesus is always calling the law and the prophets as the North Star for where the will and the power of God is. Then we divided the nave itself into two sections, which you can also see on our little handbill. So stage left, as we look, our right, looking onto this scene, are the Judeans. We have a column of Judeans and then a column of Gentiles. Oftentimes, in this first part of Mark, the ministry of Jesus is divided between these two groups of people. Much more heavily, of course, towards the Judeans, and as we'll see with the Syrophoenician woman, controversially towards the to the Gentiles.
We have never seen anything like this.
There's definitely a couple of moments where it was one thing to have everything memorized from Mark 1 through 10. It was another to interact with people while trying to give these lines. As of course, any actor may, of course, know that they struggle with. It was new to me, and Katie also was shepherding me back to the right section of the gospel.
All right, Levi's speaking to somebody. Who's the Levi? It's going to be a Judean crowd later on. We need Levi's.
We're looking for a Levi.
Way to go, Jen.
Give it up for Levi.
And he saw Levi, son of Alphaeus, and he said to him,
Follow me.
and he got up, and he followed him. And as he sat at dinner in Levi's house,
well, something to say real briefly here is Jesus calling Levi there was for Levi to get up and follow him. And that phrase, to get up, to rise, and to follow Jesus, is often mirrors healings, callings of the disciples, and kind of one of the large views of interpretation is that for me, reading this part of Mark, the before Easter part, chapters 1 through 10, is that Mark meant to prefigure the resurrection of Jesus in all of these smaller resurrections. Something as small as the calling of Levi to get up. Simon's mother-in-law, he raises her to new life. And so each of these miracles and callings, in some ways, some more explicitly and others more implicitly, prefigure the resurrection itself, capital R, resurrection.
The wedding attendants cannot fast while the bridegroom is with them. As long as they have the bridegroom with them, they cannot fast. The days will come.
Here we have Mitchell playing the part of Jesus, preparing the altar table in anticipation of what's to come before, but also the first time that Mark, the Gospel of Mark uses the word disciples when Jesus is sitting at the table with the tax collectors and sinners and breaking bread with them. Again, a prefigurement of what will happen later with the disciples at the Last Supper, and also for the church that's to follow, that we are to feast with one another.
The disciples began to pluck heads of grain. When the Pharisees saw this,
So often in the Gospel of Mark, there's images of wine and much more common bread. As David, the story we just heard is Jesus retelling the story of David breaking into the temple to steal the bread of the presence, to feed, again, the feeding bread to people, something that we'll see quite a bit of in this play, and a prefigurement of the Eucharist, but of course also Jesus' very real concern to meet the material needs of those who are hungry and in need.
Was made for humankind, not humankind for the Sabbath. So it is that the Son of Man is Lord, even.
Now these signs here, I had meant to have them flipped to begin with, so that when the play started, they would be black and something to be revealed as we went through, and just forgot to turn them around. We'll have to get them right next time. But I wanted to name a few of the central temptations that Jesus addresses again and again throughout this play. The first one we named as idolatry. As you just heard Jesus say, the Sabbath is made for humankind and not humankind for the Sabbath. And that is, of course, Jesus thought that the Sabbath as an essential law, essential part of the law to keep is good and holy. And yet the observation of the Sabbath can be misused and can be turned into itself a kind of idol, a theme that Jesus will return to again in chapter 7, which we'll see, and then dramatically at the end of chapter 9.
Is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath, or to kill?
Another idea behind the play is to dramatize what I took to be the central themes. So there's the central temptations right there in front of the altar, and then a central disjunct in the gospel is presented in chapter 3. I think Jesus presents it very clearly to the Pharisees. Is it lawful to kill or to save? And each time Jesus encounters conflict, and each time he encounters a place of conflict, or a place to do a miracle or correction of the disciples, I think very fundamentally he's coming back to this reflection on the law. Is the law meant to save or to kill, to heal or to destroy, to resurrect or for death? And of course, Jesus answers to save by bringing people back to life, to healing, to new life, and the strong men, the powerful, in this case the religious authorities, won't answer him directly. There's silence, but they do answer by going out to conspire with the Herodians, again the strong men, to kill Jesus right there at the very beginning of the gospel. So it's no wonder, of course, that Jesus' own death was always on his mind. They made it very clear from the beginning that the whole point was to kill someone who had challenged them in such an existential way.
And to have authority to cast out demons. Simon, to whom he gave the name Peter, James, the son of Zebedee, and John, to whom he gave the name Boanerges, that is, the sons of thunder, and Andrew, and Philip, and Thomas, and Matthew, and Bartholomew, and James, the son of Alphaeus, and Thaddeus, and Simon the Canaanian, and Judas Iscariot, who handed him over. Then he went home.
Right now we're in the second section of the play, the outlaw ministry. or at the end of chapter 1, it says Jesus could no longer go into a town openly, but stayed out in the country. And then there is which we just saw in chapter 3, the dramatic challenge in the, not in the temple, but in the synagogue, where Jesus flagrantly breaks what they consider to be Sabbath law.
And if a house is divided against itself, that house will not be able to stand. And if Satan...
Here we come to the famous line of the strongmen. So much of my interpretation of Mark comes from Chad Meyer's book, Binding the Strong Man, which was hugely influential in my approach here.
Can enter a strong man's house and plunder his property without first binding the strong man. Then indeed the house can be plundered. His mother and brothers were standing outside calling to him, and a crowd was sitting around him, and they said to him,
"Your mother and your brothers are calling to you."
And he replied,
"Who are my mother and who are my brothers?"
And looking at those who sat around him.
Again, we have Jesus, Mark, prefiguring the Eucharistic feast. They're in a small house, and there's a crowd around Jesus. His family, his blood relations are outside the house, and others are gathered inside around. And Jesus gives, again, I think, to be fundamental to the rest of the gospel, this revision of what his community is, which is not about blood relations, but whoever does the will of God. And what is the will of God? It's to save, it's to resurrect, it's to bring life. All right, here's a break. We're into the next section, section 3 of the play, the parables. Could only imagine it both as a dance party, bringing the kids up.
And as he sowed, come on, dance with me. Where are you? Come on, kids. Come on, kids. Come on, dance. A sower went out.
Everyone gathering around the sea, pressing in on Jesus. So him getting out into the water, looking back, and to give these images of what the kingdom of God is like.
Since it had no depth of soil. Let me hear it, DJ. And it sprang up quickly, since it had no depth of soil. And when the sun rose, it was scorched. And since it had no
It's great to see how many kids came out to both be participants in the play and also who just came to see it. We've been using the phrase that this play is an ongoing part of St. Columba's attempt at deep learning with the Gospel of Mark. Deep learning, of course, is aspirational, and the idea was to approach the gospel not just in Bible study form, Bible study being just absolutely crucial to a church community, a chance to hear the word, but also to reflect with one another and to hear other people hearing the word, and those conversations and interactions, and a little bit of clarity through study, through what our ancestors have left us to reflect on, as one aspect of it, a Bible study. And then the other aspect of it is this play, which is to create a visual representation of what the gospel might look like being played out, being lived out. Of course, it could take any number of different forms. We try to give it a coherent image, a coherent look. And the deep learning is ongoing. Well, I should say the other part of it was for the Reverend Reagan Sutterfield and I to do a mini podcast, kind of laying out some of the essential themes of the early parts of the Gospel of Mark, basically chapters 2 and 3, as something that will kind of open up and expand understanding for the rest of the Gospel. Going forward, I mean, this is just our first attempt at the play. I hope it is not the last. And going forward, we hope Katie and Mitchell and I, Katie with the children's ministry, Mitchell with youth ministry, and myself helping to lead that team to create a curriculum for Epiphany 2025 that will have, during Sunday school, kids both give some instruction about what the Gospel of Mark is, and having them interacting at a really early time in the Sunday school setting with what the gospel is, asking lots of questions and giving them a little bit of content. So a curriculum, a Sunday school curriculum based on this play. And then we're going to move it forward, as fun as it was to do it on the feast of vigil of Palm Sunday. Putting it so close to Holy Week made it logistically kind of insane for the staff. Just the church building itself, there was so much going on. Anyway, so we're going to move it back to the first Saturday, I think, of Lent is what we've got it tentatively scheduled for. But anyway, so we'll have the children and the youth going through a series of study through Epiphany on the gospel and the play, and then we're going to invite them to reprise a whole bunch of these roles and have them play it out. And so the deep learning part is to integrate a little bit of instruction, a whole bunch of reflection, and then a chance to act it out, and then to repeat that model. So I think one of the best pedagogical models I've been a part of was as a chaplain in a hospital, where we would reflect together on some of the things that we'd experienced. Then we'd go back out into the hospital for various responsibilities and duties, and then come back and reflect on it. So the action reflection model, allowing the material to get deeper into us, more expansive, more holistic. And the hope is that after several years of this, as these kids grow up, hopefully with this action reflection model on Mark, they will leave our program when they graduate or move on to the next thing with not necessarily ideological indoctrination, but a real sense about what the claims are, and hopefully they will have added to it and changed it for us. There will not be a static thing, but we will also learn from them as they encounter it, and them from us. And anyway, so that's the hope for the deep learning part. Notice that the lighting has changed. We used the lighting to also mark some dramatic moments in the gospel, and here we are with the demoniac in the tombs throwing himself in front of Jesus.
He replied, "My name is Legion, for we are many." He begged him earnestly not to send him out of the region. Now, there on the hillside, a great herd of swine was feeding.
Already, let's see where we are. Just 30 minutes, well, almost, not quite halfway through the play. We're into the fourth section, the building the kingdom, Mark 5 through 7.
And entered the swine, and the herd, numbering about 2,000, stampeded down the steep bank into the sea and were drowned in the sea. The swineherd ran off to tell it in the city and the country. Then people came to see what had happened. They came to see Jesus. Come here, Anthony. And the man possessed by demons, sitting there, clothed. Take a seat, bud. Clothed in his right mind. The very man who had had the legion. The very man who had had the legion. And they became frightened. Those who had seen what happened to the man possessed by demons and to the swine reported it. Then they began to beg Jesus to leave their neighborhood. As he was stepping into the boat, the man who had been possessed by demons begged him to be with him. But Jesus refused and said to him,
Go home to your own people and tell how much the Lord has done for you and the mercy he has shown you.
And he went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus.
So there's an interesting question here about where to put the man who'd been possessed by demons. Jesus refuses to allow him to follow with the disciples, so we couldn't put him in the boat. But notice that what the man does, Mark tells us, is he proclaims in the Decapolis. And proclaiming the gospel of Mark is more or less synonymous as one who is an evangelist for the gospel. So Jesus raises him to new life. The new life is not yet with the disciples. There's some other work that Jesus has to do before integrating. We pulled Anthony, who played there at the end, the man possessed by demons, from the Gentile side of the church, which you can't see. Jesus isn't ready to integrate them with the disciples, but yet he still enables him, empowers him to be an evangelist to the Gentiles. And so he sets up in the new kingdom.
She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him and touched his cloak, for she said, immediately aware that power had gone forth from.
I don't mean exactly for this commentary to be a commentary on the gospel itself, but this what I will call the faithful woman as being the archetype of faith, which is a remarkable image given us to Mark. Unlike Jairus, wait, do I have this right?
Jesus said to her,
Yeah.
Daughter, your faith has made you well.
Yes.
Go in
Yes.
peace.
So, unlike Jairus, who comes and doesn't demand Jesus to do this or that, but he begs, it says, but there is a sense of entitlement, I think. And rather for the faithful woman, she's in the crowd, she touches his cloak, just hoping to not even be seen, wanting to touch Jesus, but not wanting to even bother him. And yet, when Jesus requests to see who touched me, she comes forward and she's truthful to him. Jesus holds this up as the archetype of what faith is like. Without presumption, certainly not out of a sense of has got everything together, but in brokenness, in distress, throwing oneself into the life of God and trusting that God will catch is an archetype of faith for Jesus here.
and took the child's father and mother, just kneel, and went in where the child was. And taking her by the hand, he lifted her up and said,
Talitha cum.
This is
which
Jairus'
means,
daughter.
little girl, get up. Immediately she stood up and began to walk about. She was about
Again,
12 years of
resurrection
age.
imagery.
He sternly ordered them not to tell anyone about it and told them to give her something to eat.
I cut only 2 small sections from the gospel. We did a couple of rehearsals. In the second rehearsal, which was just the night before the play itself, I think it's fair to say went off the rails, and I had hoped it would be no longer than the play itself, but after 2.5 hours we still hadn't finished, and I had advertised that the play would be no more than 90 minutes, and I had a real sense of crisis that night about whether we'd be able to pull it off. Perfect trust in everyone else, but not perfect trust in myself, and I cut a couple of the parables from chapter 4, and then I cut a teaching section from chapter 7 that we're about to get to, which is wonderful and important. But I cut parts that would only affect my lines, because I didn't want to cut anyone out from the performance. I also cut another part in chapter 9, or chapter 10, which is Jesus' teaching on divorce, which again was just a whole lot more words that were not interactive, and also something that really begs for interpretation, which is not what the play is about.
But to wear sandals and to not put on 2 tunics.
Again, trying to highlight some of these themes that Mark returns to again and again throughout this first 10 chapters.
Shake off the dust that is on your feet as a testimony against them. So they went out.
Interesting that Mark says to not bring bread, having bread so important elsewhere. And I think part of the idea there is Mark not saying that bread isn't important for the journey, but that the bread will be supplied on the journey. So to not have everything figured out before the journey, before the mission begins, but to trust yourself to be supplied to trust yourself to be supplied by the people that you are ministering with, and not just to. Here we have the anti-kingdom, a real break from the narrative, Herod and his evil kingdom.
Because Herod had married her. For John had been telling Herod, it's not lawful for you to have your brother's wife. And Herodias had a grudge against him and wanted to kill him, but she could not, for Herod feared John, knowing that he was a righteous and holy man, and he protected him. But an opportunity came when Herod, on his birthday, gave a banquet for his courtiers and officers and for the leaders of Galilee. When his daughter Herodias came in and danced, she pleased Herod and his guests. And the king said to the girl,
"Ask me for whatever you wish, and I will give it."
And he swore to her,
"Whatever you ask of me, I will give you, even half of my kingdom."
She went out and said to her mother,
"What should I ask for?"
She replied,
"Ask for the head of John the Baptist on a platter."
Whew. Immediately, the girl rushed back to the king and requested,
"I want the head of John the Baptist on a platter."
I think part of what's happening here with Mark is to set up just these dual visions of power between the type of kingdom that Jesus means to initiate and the kind of kingdom and power that currently supposedly rules. What's at parody here is that there's anything sincere about Herod, that he wanted to uphold his oaths, and this is belied by Herod's deceitful and wicked actions again and again and again, unlike the true sincerity of Jesus and John.
The apostles gathered around Jesus and told him all they had done and taught. He said to them,
"Come away to a deserted place by yourselves and rest a while."
For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. And they had no leisure even to eat. So they went away in a boat to a deserted place by themselves. Now, many saw them going. Judeans, please stand. Now, many saw them going and recognized them.
All right, so you've got the entire column of the church, one whole column standing, everyone who represents the Judeans, for the first feeding story. The word compassion there in Greek, my understanding is the most literal interpretation of it would be that Jesus had his guts ripped out. I think one of the things that really interesting to think about the things that play changed for me in my own understanding of what the gospel is. I'd say a couple of those things is how much yelling there is in the gospel between Jesus and the people that interact with Jesus. Jesus was encountering people who were in desperate need, and just reading the gospel from the written page in the Bible, it's easy to skip over that, or to not, but taking it slowly, you can see Mark makes it really clear what the great need was, and Jesus' overwhelming response, and there, Mark noting that Jesus' response was compassion, that he was just kind of devastated when he saw the crowd, and the necessity of acting, and how important it was for Jesus to not solve the problem just by himself. He tells the disciples that they are the ones responsible for feeding. So that's both kind of a literal historical thing, right? Mark means to capture the sense that what he's writing is the remembrance of what actually happened to some degree, but also speaking directly to the church, that the church is responsible for meeting the material needs of the communities that they are in. And here again, we could prefigure a Eucharistic feast by literally taking the bread and distributing it to first the Judeans.
The oars against an adverse wind, he came toward them early in the morning, walking on the sea. He intended to pass them by. But when they saw him walking on the sea, they cried out. Ah! For they all saw him and were terrified. But immediately he spoke to them and said,
Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid.
And he got into the boat with them, and the wind ceased. And he got into the boat with them, and the wind ceased. They were utterly astounded, for they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened.
Here we see an important transition in the gospel, where those who had hardened hearts before were the Pharisees, the scribes, the Herodians. And this part of the gospel, the sea journey, where Jesus meets them out on the sea, you start to see a rift in understanding between the disciples and Jesus turning to them, though he had suspicions before, but turns to them and accuses them of some of the most salacious language. He'll use more salacious language when we get to Peter trying to keep him from talking about going to the cross. But he says to them, are your hearts hardened? And especially around the loaves, that they just couldn't comprehend the importance of the loaves for Jesus' ministry and for the future ministry of the church.
His disciples were eating with defiled hands, that is, without washing them. For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they wash their hands. Thus, observing the tradition.
Having just interacted with the Gentiles, it's very interesting that Mark has the very next story, a question about purity rites, especially around ritualistic eating. Again, prefiguring the trouble that the church would have in integrating different communities, especially around racial lines with the Gentiles. Here I'm standing over with the prophets, the laws and the prophets, and holding the law itself up as the exemplar, as the icon of what Jesus is up to right now. Returning again to the central themes. Are these rules about saving or for killing, for death? So important. I guess something that I still struggle with reminding myself is that none of these laws, all of these laws, all of these phrases, all of these images can either liberate or imprison. They can lead to life or they could lead to death, depending on how one uses it. And Jesus, returning again and again to this theme, that there's nothing inherently good about X, even something as great as the Sabbath, if the Sabbath is being used for harmful purposes.
Immediately heard about him, and she came and fell down at his feet. Now, the woman was a Gentile.
Kathleen stepped in. This is Kathleen, who plays the Syrophoenician woman, stepped in at the last minute. Does just a great job with this part.
He said to her,
Let the children be fed first. It's not right to take the children's food and feed it to the dogs.
Mitchell and I talked quite a bit about how to characterize Jesus' actions here.
then he said to her,
You see a flash of anger on Jesus' face
Saying that, go home,
as she challenges him.
the demon has left her.
And then something breaks, and how to represent that breaking. Jesus was on a certain path with this woman and did an abrupt face and conceded ground to her. And I think one of the most provocative stories in this part of Mark.
He took him aside in private, away from the crowd. And when he put his fingers in his ears and spat and touched his tongue, he sighed and looked up to heaven and said,
Epitha.
that is, be opened. And his ears were opened, his tongue was released, and he spoke plainly. Then he ordered them to tell no one. But the more he ordered them, the more zealously they proclaimed it, saying, He's done everything well.
Again, Mark works both on just a straightforward kind of historical recounting of the life of Jesus and the ministry of Jesus, and then also at this the mystical, spiritual level. Just remarkable that the healing words of Jesus there are just merely, simply, be open.
If I send them away hungry to their homes, they will faint on the way, and some of them have come from a great distance. His disciples replied,
Second healing, so we've got
How
the
can one
Gentiles
feed these
coming
people
up.
with bread here in the desert?
He asked them,
How many loaves do you have?
7.
Then he ordered the crowd.
Again, returning to the central theme, which we conveniently put in the center of the play, the bread,
He took the 7
right there on the
loaves,
altar.
and after giving thanks, he broke them.
There's a little bit of discussion about whether we are actually performing the Eucharist, which, well, of course, we decided that we were not performing the Eucharist, missing the words of institution, among other things. But,
And were filled.
I mean, it was great that question got raised during rehearsal about whether this is actually a Eucharist, because, of course, we meant to use the iconography of the church of a worship service. And to get so close to it, to have someone ask that question, hopefully communicates a bit of the effectiveness of the image.
The Pharisees immediately came, asking him.
Audrey and Scott playing the disciples there, various different roles of the disciples, just doing a great job, real troopers.
And said,
Why does this generation ask for a sign?
Again, the deep emotion that we get here. Mark telling us that he sighs deeply out of his frustration. Again, it would be so easy to pass over on the written word, but seeing Jesus' high emotions coming out, big emotions as we call it in our house, the big emotions of Jesus.
Beware of the yeast of Herod and the yeast of the Pharisees.
They said to one another,
It's because we have no bread.
Becoming aware of it, Jesus said, "Why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not understand? Do you not perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes and fail to see? Do you have ears and fail to hear? And do you not remember when I broke the 5 loaves to the 5,000? How many baskets full of broken pieces did you collect?"
You can see that we're getting close to the end of the play. We have almost all 12 seats filled. The 12 mini resurrections that happen in this first part of Mark.
Understand? Do you not yet understand? Do you not yet understand?
There were a couple parts where, though it
They
is
came to
word for
Bethsaida.
word, we repeated
Some
some of
people
those
brought
words
a blind
for
man
emphasis.
to him and begged him to touch him. And he took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the village. When he put saliva on his eyes, he laid his hands on him and asked him.
Again, the hope, of course, the hope is that seeing the gospel played out like this might help with just the thing that Jesus is always so concerned about, which is blindness. Or, as we'll hear in a second, that what the man was cleared to live is that he saw all things clearly. And so here I bring this child to right in front of the altar space, to the whole community gathered around in Jesus' new kingdom. And what is his reaction? He sees everything clearly. And we are at the penultimate healing for this section of the gospel. It's the longest section, though. Power reconsidered. The discourses on both Jesus going to the cross and also the kind of life that Jesus is calling his disciples to, which is the way of the cross.
"Who do you say that I am?" Peter answered.
You are the Messiah.
He sternly ordered them not to tell anyone about him. Then he sternly ordered them not to tell anyone about him. Then he began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again.
Throughout the Gospel of Mark, the apocalyptic literature is so present. And part of the apocalyptic literature that Mark inherited was this just strong sense of dualism. And the dualism is preserved in lots of different ways in this play. The binary choice between to save or to kill. Also the binary choice to be a part of the community of strong men or the community of the law and the prophets. But so often those very simple choices about which path to follow, Jesus presents.
And follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it. And those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the good news will save it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Indeed, what can they give in return for their life? Those who are ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of them the Son of Man will also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels. Then he said to them, there are some standing here who will not taste death
until they see that the kingdom of heaven has come.
Mark transitioning into the second God breaking through into the actual story with the transfiguration, used as a moment for change in dress for Mitchell, our character of Jesus.
And there appeared with them Elijah and Moses, who were talking with Jesus. Then Peter said to him, Rabbi,
So I should say, I'm so used to encountering a lot of the imagery in the Bible that Jesus in the Transfiguration appeared in the translation we used as dazzling bright. I should say, well, let me just finish that thought. Very interesting to think about what dazzling bright means and what was trying to be communicated. Of course, it comes back to this apocalyptic imagery in part, that the purity of the Son of Man as judge, as equal, fair, impartial, judge for all, for whom God shows no preference other than the righteousness of one, and without corruption. But still, to think about what part, why the white robes so effectively communicate that image, I think is worth some reflection. Just to say about the translation, a new translation has come out that is supposed to replace the NRSV, the New Revised Standard. The New Revised Standard, of course, is a replace of the Revised Standard, and the Revised Standard is a replacement of the King James. So this is the great-great-great-great-grandchild of the King James Version. And what I expect will eventually be used in for the lectionary, both in the Episcopal Church and more broadly in the Catholic community. So if you are looking for the translation that we used for this play, it is the NRSVue updated edition, which you can find online and in the comments below.
She has a spirit that makes her unable to speak, and whenever it seizes her, it dashes her down, and she foams and grinds her teeth and becomes rigid. I asked your disciples to cast it out, but they could not do so. He said,
You faithless generation. How long must I be with you? How long must I put up with you?
Again, this is a perfect instance of trying to figure out who exactly is Jesus upset at. He says, the faithless generation. And the person who preceded him talking immediately was, of course, this man who brought his son possessed by a demon. And it might easily occur to one that Jesus is yelling at him for being faithless, and then to draw the supposition that he's somehow at fault at his son's being taken by a demon. But there we tried to have Mitchell orient himself with those comments towards the strongmen, and perhaps more rightly to the disciples whom Jesus mentions as, or the Father mentions having failed to heal his son. And there the idea is the community not addressing the needs of the people around them in any effective way. There again, Mark is just loaded with this type of imagery. Having Jesus turn to the father of the child and say to him, having Mark say, and Jesus asked the father, I don't know enough to make a bold claim there, but it just mirrors so closely Jesus on the cross crying out to his own father. I think there's a real parallel there. And lifted her up. There again, we're returning to the resurrection language in perhaps the most ultimate way before we get to Jesus' own resurrection. And with that healing, we have we've completed the cycle of the early resurrections, and thus complete the spelling. Resurrection just happens to be 12 letters, and it's revealed that what we're spelling out the whole time, that the new community of God gathered around the bread and the wine at the altar is the resurrection community, the community of resurrection.
Then they came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house,
Going up to Jerusalem.
he asked them, "What were you arguing about on the way?" For on the way they had argued with one another who was the greatest. He sat down and called the 12 and said to them,
Really, we're thinking quite a bit here about the kind of the reconsiderations that Jesus is asking us to, on the issue about power, and just how central it is into the new community that Jesus is building, that one must really completely wholesale revisit conceptions of power in that community and the great reversals that Jesus means to perform.
James asked him,
"Teacher, we saw someone casting out demons in your name, and we tried to stop him because he was not following us."
but Jesus said, "Do not stop him. For no one who does a deed of power in my name..."
We're coming back to the three temptations that I've tried to imagine or name for the gospel: idolatry, money, rigid rule following. Again, one of the things that was so fun about trying to incarnate the gospel into the play in this way, to kind of give it flesh and bones and visual performance, is something I hadn't done intentionally. I put those three temptations right where they are so that people could see them. But what it turned out to do, accidentally as it was, is to have these three temptations be between us and the altar. These three things can be the thing that keep us from joining that resurrected community, from inhabiting and living out what that community is supposed to be, and so thus acts as a visual barrier, but also a spiritual barrier. Thought it's so important to give some visceral imagery to that section at the very end of chapter 9, which is to cut off hands and feet and tear out eyes, because though none of the disciples were physically blind or ripped out their own eyes or cut off their own hands, it's still such a knee-jerk reaction to hear Jesus say something with such violent imagery, to think that Jesus is somehow endorsing violence in that way. But of course, none of the disciples did this to themselves, and so the question is, what did Jesus have in mind there? And here the interpretation is that he returned to these three great temptations: idolatry, rigid rule following, and money, and is imploring his disciples to make a clean break from them, to not be in a compromised, negotiated stance, but a clean break.
You know the commandments: you shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal, you shall not defraud, you shall not bear false witness, honor your father and mother. He said to him,
I have lived with these commandments all my
Again, it would be very easy to have that litany of things to do or not do, the commandments, and to think about them as just checking off lists. But of course, Jesus is trying to get to a way that isn't transactional with them, that you're getting to the actual heart of the matter instead of blindly following rules to see what their actual effect is in the community.
for he had many possessions. Then Jesus looked around and said to his disciples, "How hard it will be to enter the kingdom of God."
We're in Act 5, for which there is 3 parts. Power reconsidered 1, 2, and 3. We've come to the last one.
And the disciples were perplexed at these words. But turning and looking at them, he said to them again,
This last confrontation in the play with the disciples is, again, wonderful in how starkly Mark presents the way of Jesus and the way that we want to take the opposite way in both Peter's response and in James and John's response in the next story that will follow this one.
It is impossible, but not for God. For God, all things are possible. Peter began to say to him,
Look, we have left everything and followed you.
Jesus said, "Truly I tell you, there is no one who has left house or brothers or sisters or mother or father or fields for my sake and for the sake of the good news, who will not receive 100-fold now in this age, brothers and sisters, houses, mothers and children, and fields with persecutions, and in the age to come, eternal life. But many who are first will be last, and the last will be first." They were on the road. We're almost done. They were on the road going up to Jerusalem, and Jesus was walking ahead of them. The disciples were amazed. And listen, those who followed him, they were afraid. They were afraid. Jesus took the 12 aside again and began to tell them that the Son of Man will be handed over, that we're going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be handed over to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death.
Did not put this in the sketch for the handbill, but as you'll see in a minute, we have the back of the nave as representing the path to Jerusalem, as I just tried to indicate with my hands.
The son of Zebedee came forward to him and said to him,
Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you.
"What is it you want me to do for you?"
Appoint us to sit, one at your right hand and one at your left, in your glory.
But Jesus said to them, "You do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with?"
We are able.
"The cup that I drink, you will drink, and with the baptism that I am baptized with, you will be baptized. But to sit at my right hand or at my left."
Again, we've come to another very enigmatic saying and teaching of Jesus. I don't know if we got that one right, but the straightforward interpretation that worked really well with the play is that James and John are right to want to sit around the Eucharistic table, to drink the bread, to eat the bread, drink the wine. I did not figure out a way to include the baptismal font in the iconography of the play. That would have been great to have done. Didn't quite get there. Maybe next time. And so Jesus, what I take Jesus to be doing there is James and John saying, point us to sit at your right hand and your left hand. That's up there with the strong men, right? James and John wanted power not to be reconsidered. They wanted old traditional power, the power to lay waste to their enemies or to be held in high esteem. but Jesus redirects them to the cross. All right, so we've got the entire Eucharistic party, the new kingdom, the kingdom of the resurrected, processing out behind the cross towards Jerusalem for this last story with Bartimaeus.
Served, but to serve and to give his life a ransom for many. They came to Jericho. As he and his disciples and a large crowd were leaving Jericho, they saw Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus, a blind beggar, sitting there by the roadside. When he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout out and say,
"Way to go, Jamal.
Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me." Many sternly ordered him to be quiet. But he cried out even more loudly, "Son of David, have mercy on me."
Where John was
Jesus stood still and said,
Bartimaeus,
"Call him
another
here."
and they called the blind man. And they called him, saying, "Take heart, get up."
Get up. Again, would have worked to have Bartimaeus as the last healing in the kingdom, but they're on the road then. So Bartimaeus we have as me giving voice initially, but then inviting the whole assembly to rise as Bartimaeus.
"My teacher, I want to see again."
What do you want me to do for you? I said, what do you want me to do for you?
Then Jesus said to them,
Go, your faith has made you well.
Immediately they regained their sight and followed him on the way. Let's go, y'all. Come on, out this way.
All right, there we go. So there's the ending. The ending is, we'll see how many people actually. I don't remember what happened, but the ending is to have co-opted all these people into the kingdom of God. So Jesus is pulling people in left and right into the kingdom, and then the very end, it turns out we're all Bartimaeus. Jesus is calling all of us to follow him on the way to Jerusalem, to the cross. So this is very much midway of the story, but the story continues in this telling the very next day, which is Palm Sunday. So the very first scripture that we would read on the next day, less than 12 hours away, would be Mark chapter 11. Jesus coming to at Bethsaida, and about to descend the Mount of Olives. Okay, so there's the commentary on the play. Thanks for listening. Thanks for getting to the end of it. Of course, would love to hear from you. You can find my email online on our website, and more information about this project in deep learning at St. Columba's. Of course, we hope to do the play again, as I said, at the beginning of Lent this year and not at the very end of it, and to develop a curriculum for the kids to participate in it. We'd very much like for the play to be expansive beyond just St. Columba's. So if you have a youth group or a group of kids who are interested in taking on one of these roles, there will always be more roles to fill than we have people who are willing to fill them. So we'd love to hear from you. All right, peace.